Well, welcome. My name's Chris Gaskell. I'm a Warden of the Honourable Company, but in this context, I'm chair of the Business Interest Group. And in the interest group, we've been having some interesting conversations over the last few months, particularly, as you'd imagine, around the crisis and what's going to happen as a result of the pandemic. We thought it'd be quite interesting to share some of those conversations that we're having between ourselves more widely with members. And so I'm very pleased that Peter Randall, also a member of the Business Interest Group, has joined me today to just have a chat about how it is for him and his business, and in the hope that some of his experience and expertise will be of value. So Peter, thanks for joining us, and tell us a bit about the business that you're involved in.
Well, Chris, thank you very much indeed for asking, and for asking me to come and have a brief chat about this. It's obviously been a difficult period for all of us, both from, I guess, from a lives perspective, but also from a livelihood perspective. And those of us in business who are in the wealth generation side. And my business does a number of things. We have a renewables part of our business, which designs, supplies and installs renewable energy for people's homes and for businesses. So that's heat pumps and solar thermal and solar PV, that sort of thing. We also have a business which installs and sells gas boilers, and we finance those. And we have a platform, a financial platform, that enables consumers to match with installers and ensure that they can have their boilers financed, because always the trouble with a boiler is it always breaks down when you least expect it. And most people don't want to spend their £2,500 in the bank on a new boiler, so it's a way of financing it. So we have a package that does that. So I guess we're in the finance industry. We're also heavily involved in energy, and we also, as a result of what we do, we're considered to be an essential service, and therefore we go into people's homes to both repair boilers, but also to install them too, and heating systems. Okay, so are you having a good war or a bad war? A mixed war, I think. Yeah. And I think it depends a bit on where you are. I think one of the most important things for us from a business perspective has been about how we react to the opportunity, as opposed to thinking purely about the threat. And I think we have pivoted a lot in terms of what we do. We've launched products, particularly on the financial side, where we have digital risk assessment tool. And one of the things that we have been doing for years in the boiler industry is that we've always, rather than visiting somebody's home to survey the home and have a chat and a cup of tea about the new heating system they want, we've been doing that by photographs and by video. And what was interesting was when this whole thing started, a number of our competitors and also manufacturers came to us and asked, so you've been doing this for a long time, everyone said it wasn't possible, how do you do it? So what we've actually done is put a package together which we're now selling into the market, which means that those people don't have to go into people's homes to survey the property. It can be done by video, or it can be done by photographs. So I guess that's an example of where we've changed. Now, are we having a good one or a bad one? Initially, our sales dropped by 60%. Yeah. I think the shock. It'll be very interesting to see what happens on Thursday of this week, actually, just in terms of straightforward sales. I think there's less fear now than there was, and we're all better at handling entering other people's homes. So I think the answer to your question is, as I said, is mixed. Certainly the digital side, it's moved the digital world on dramatically, and we've certainly wanted to take advantage of that opportunity. That seems to be a common experience, isn't it? I mean, my expertise, such as it is in education, in higher education, and I was at a Zoom meeting only yesterday, where people were, as is happening elsewhere, talking about 10 years progress made in 6 months. And I think that's, so you created a new product essentially, haven't you? Which you know. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the most interesting tool that we haven't yet launched is a video, which is a bit like Zoom really, but actually for tradesmen. Yeah. And the reason it was interesting was because actually all of those products come out of the west coast of the US. So for the first time, this was actually coming out of the UK. So that actually made us feel quite good in our own right. That doesn't sell the product, but it certainly helps. But yes, we now have we have tools. We call it the Trades Toolbox, and it is a digital tool for a digital world. And it's been very interesting the way those tradesmen have taken to it, because traditionally tradesmen don't like technology and they don't like paperwork. And they probably don't like sweeping the floor afterwards either. But actually, in this environment, they're being forced to move down a digital route, and probably a little more slowly than others have. But as you rightly point out, the last 6 months has been a massive transformation in people using technology to their advantage, and that's got to be the way forward, I think. And it's also been interesting from an employment perspective too, because we've taken on young people who are developers. In order to develop that technology. And I guess it would have been more difficult to get those people in before we had COVID than it has been during COVID, because actually there's less employment for them. So we're actually getting good people too.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about finding the skills for these new tools you're creating. I mean, there's two issues there that you touched on already. One is upskilling the tradesmen so that they can use the tools you're developing, but also finding people in the first instance to develop them in presumably what wasn't your core business.
No, definitely not. I mean, although traditionally I've come out of the telecoms industry and I guess the internet side, so I guess I have an understanding, but I'm absolutely not a developer. And getting hold of those people who do it it's been tremendous actually, and it's always been wonderful, I think, when you deal with young people who've perhaps just left university, and you'd have a lot of experience of it. They just don't know what they can do, and as a result they do some fantastic things, and that's certainly what's happened here. The other interesting thing is that the people that we've hired, of course, hadn't met in person anybody in the company, so everyone is working from home. And that's been a big change too, a massive change, and culturally a big change.
Yeah, what's the legacy of that? I mean, I was thinking the other day, we're holding a lot of our meetings with all the organizations we're involved with by Zoom, and we're relying in many instances on the fact that we have met in the past and we do know each other and we know how each other ticks, and therefore we can transpose more easily to a virtual environment. But you're talking now about a cohort of workers, people you employ, colleagues who've never met, and there must be. Is there a downside to that?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think we have two meetings. We're now a much smaller business. So in that particular business, there are 21 of us, and we have 2 calls a day. And the cynic would suggest that the timings we have them are to ensure that they're actually around at the right time. One is at 10:25 and one is at 2:35.
Right.
But actually it was put at those times in order that it wasn't at the 2:30 or the 3 o'clock time, which is actually when most people have their calls. So actually the pressure on Zoom tended to be on the hour of a half hour. So we have 2 calls a day. Everybody's on it. It used to be the 10:25 call, we had an energizer. The people around the table, the people who are at the meeting, choose the energizer. So today's energizer was chosen by one of the employees, a slightly older one. What was the first car you bought? How much did you pay for it? And what car would you choose to have if money was no object? Now that's a really quite an interesting question.
Yeah.
And everybody gets a chance to speak it. So the person who's just left university or the person who doesn't. And then halfway through, there was some discussion about where one of the chaps came from. And he came from Southport. And one of the people in the then said, goodness me, that's an awfully long way north. And there was a Scotsman on the call, a Scottish girl on the call. And she was then started a complete discussion about the geography of the United Kingdom. But the good news was, the reason we do it is it is the time they have around the kitchen when they're getting their coffee, which ordinarily they wouldn't get. So it's a downtime for them to talk a bit about themselves and for them to have a chat, because some people, like developers, for example, can spend all day never talking to anybody. So I think we have 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. We only have 1 energizer a day. That's been a really good thing to do, excellent thing to do. It takes up about 20 minutes of our time, and the whole company is involved in it. If you have a good reason not to attend, then that's fine, usually talking to a customer. But that's worked really well. How will it work in the future? We've downsized our offices, so we have reduced our office space. And I guess my vision would be we'll probably end up with people being in the office for 2 or 3 days a week, and the other 2 or 3 days a week they're working from home, because certainly there was a view, which probably I shared, that those people who are working from home are spending more time doing the washing than they are doing work for us. That is absolutely not the case.
Yeah.
And I think the whole mentality of that has changed. And you can do your work, actually by walking down the street, probably just going to go and pick up your paper. You can still be speaking to somebody on the telephone. Yeah. And there isn't this belief, well, if they're walking down the street talking to you on the phone, they're doing nothing. There's actually much more of a, I guess, a wholeness of people's lives. So it'll be good for a work-life balance. Yeah. Where we are today is not good for a work-life balance. I think there's a real issue for the youngsters. Meeting people, I think, is very much more difficult now. Yeah. And they want it, and they want to have a cup of coffee, and they want to chat, and they want to go to the pub at the end of the day, which of course is more difficult to do. Yeah. But having said all of that, the other good news is we've recruited 2 people who, I guess you could argue from the honourable company's perspective isn't a good thing, but 2 people from way outside the county, and it doesn't matter where they come from.
No, that's right. That's really interesting, Peter. I think the concept of the energizer is an interesting one, isn't it? Because there are all the benefits that you discussed, and it just reminds me, again, my own experience in academia is that there used to be a thing, the much maligned senior common room, where people would gather and talk about anything over a sometimes prolonged cup of coffee. But just occasionally, serendipitously, something emerged, some lateral thought emerged from the discussions you were having, which had a very real impact on the business, whatever that business is. You suddenly think, hang on, that's it's funny you should say that, because I've noticed that, or I've been thinking that, and from that develop something of real value to the business.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the other interesting element of this working from home is when you go to the office in the morning and you say good morning to everybody as you pass. How often do we just say good morning, how are you, and actually then move to the next person without actually listening, or just the expectation to say I'm fine and then you move to the next one? Yeah. What's happening now is that the way that one does that is by having a Teams call or a Zoom call or just a phone call with an individual. And because you're on a one-to-one basis, you're actually, the questions you're asking, you're listening to the answers, which you probably didn't do in the office. And I think I know my employees, a terrible thing to say, I know my employees a lot better now because of what's happened in lockdown, because we got into much more depth in these energizers than we ever did in the office. So it's quite an interesting, it's a change. Is it good or is it bad? Who knows, but it's definitely a change.
Yeah, but it suggests that there are some silver linings to what's happening. We talked about the technological development, and you're talking about the social side, the behavioral science side, as it were, of lockdown. I think those are really important. Peter, have you used the government schemes? How useful have you found government support through these last few months?
The answer is really useful. Would one perhaps suggest they did it differently if we did it all over again? Maybe. Yeah. Not easy to come up with solutions very quickly. We've definitely used the schemes. We've used the furlough scheme. The new furlough scheme is a lot better, I think, whereby you're able to bring people back in. The initial one where you couldn't talk to them after you furloughed them was really very tricky. We've used the CBIL loan scheme, which has been very useful for us on one of our businesses. And the other good piece of news for us is the government are investing £2 billion in the Green Homes Grant Scheme, which means that every homeowner can have £5,000 made available to them to put in green technologies. Yeah. All of those things are great. The first scheme came in really quickly. The one that's been most tricky for us has been the Green Homes Grant Scheme, which was due to launch in September. They launched on the 30th of September, and they still haven't issued the first vouchers, and we're now in November. So actually, what happens when you distort the market, Mrs. Thatcher, don't buck the market, but when you distort the market, the trouble is then people then delay purchases, and if that isn't necessarily a good thing. So having said all that, when whatever government do, I think those of us who are entrepreneurs do our best to try and take the most advantage of those that we can, because that's what our job is, really. Yeah. So yes, we have definitely taken it, and without it, it would have been very difficult without those schemes. Yeah. And so we made, before this was happening, we were looking to change, and we made some people redundant, and actually their redundancies were delayed as a result of furlough, and that's got to be great news for them too.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's right. There's a human side to all this, isn't there?
Absolutely, massive human side.
Yeah, it's. I mean, you're in an industry which has a future. It's part of the longer term plan, is it? So I'm assuming for your business, you can see once we've got through this, and perhaps helped by some of the things that have come on during this, you see a bright future for yourself.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing for any business is not having any form of consistency. But you could argue that actually not knowing what's happening in the future is bad news for all of us, whether we're individuals or companies or governments for that matter.
Yes.
But what we want is an environment that we understand that we're going to work in, and then we can then plan accordingly. Yeah. And of course, the challenge that we all face at the moment is that what happened last Monday was then changed on Thursday and then re-changed on Saturday, and that makes it very difficult. So there is some, I think there is definitely, from a business perspective, there is some merit in perhaps acting sooner, being somewhat more decisive, and therefore perhaps enabling us to go to get out of this more quickly. But it's very difficult when and who would want to be, whether one likes Boris Johnson or not, who on earth would want to be in his position right now? Not easy.
Right. I mean, I'm sure he wants consistency as much as everybody else. Absolutely. Whether you, as you said, whether you carry a flag for him or not, he's got a very difficult job at the moment. Yeah. But I mean, what you're saying is, in a sense, slightly counterintuitive from a business perspective, because one understands it's the business lobby that has been having problems with lockdown because of the interruption it would cause. But your case might be that if you could make a decision and then have the impact and then get back to business more quickly, that would be
it's very unfair, I think, you can't generalize, because if you're running a pub, or you're running a cafe, or you're running a shop in Cirencester, then frankly what's happening on Thursday is a nightmare. Yeah. And it's very difficult if you're running a nightclub and any of these entertainment businesses, and those people running large events, I mean, really tricky. Yeah. Those of us who are more involved in other industries which are not based on high street or based in hospitality, I think are in a slightly more secure position. But it's not easy. It's not. I mean, it's an illusion to think it's easy for any of us, because it certainly isn't, because you really haven't got a clue what's going to happen next. Yeah. And then you try and plan for it, and unfortunately your plans. We have weekly meetings, and they're well structured, but actually, when you turn up for the meeting last Monday, you think, well, actually, what's the point of the structure? Because actually what we determined last week isn't what we're going to be discussing this week, because it just isn't.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's across the piece, isn't it? That's across
absolutely, the board. Absolutely. But, well, I don't think I'd want to be owning a pub right now. I wouldn't want to be owning a shop in the main high street in Stroud either.
Yeah. But I mean, again, I can sympathise and empathise from the business that I was directly involved in, and now less directly involved in, through being on boards of universities and things. For universities trying to decide what to do in terms of teaching, what to ask and tell students to do, what's going to happen after Christmas, all of these are dreadful uncertainties which have a huge impact on the budget, and quickly too. These aren't medium-term impacts, these are very short-term, and it's very hard.
And they had great effects on individuals. I mean, I had a phone call only this. I'm a trustee of our regimental museum, which is based at Duxford, and the curator was phoning up. She's Canadian. Should she go back to Canada tomorrow, because she wants to make sure that she's there for Christmas, and wherever one ended up isn't important. But I guess the important point is that what is happening is affecting all of these individuals throughout the whole of the United Kingdom.
Yes,
the whole world, really.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm sure you're right. Peter, we kind of promised ourselves we wouldn't go on too long because people's attention span, and we've done 25 minutes. But I just wanted to finish by asking you if you have any perspective, given that the Honourable Company is about Gloucestershire. Do you have any sense or feel for the county and how the county will come through this, and as an entity rather than individual businesses?
I think I think we're lucky because of where we're based. If you look at the spikes, they're nothing like as large as they are elsewhere. One would have hoped that the downsides that we have, or these categories, whether it's level 1, level 2, level 3, that we could have maintained ourselves at the easier levels rather than the harder ones. Unfortunately, that isn't going to happen. And I think we have a great advantage because we have a variety of businesses in the county, and patently all the digital stuff that's happened, particularly relating to what's happening at Cheltenham or GCHQ. I think all of those things are, there's employment and opportunities there which will go way beyond what's happening with this crisis. And we don't have the city lives, I guess, that you might have in Bristol or in London. Is there a long-term future for us all? Definitely. And it's interesting when one goes to Kemble Station and there are no cars at the railway station, and you go on the train and there's hardly anybody on the train either. But you know, that's going to change. These things move on. Will it change by March? Probably not. Will we have another year afterwards? Possibly. But what we need to do, I believe strongly, as a planet, as a nation, and as companies, is, you know, we are where we are. You've got to learn to live with it. And you actually it's not a question of fighting it. It's actually a question of how we're going to learn to live with these sorts of things, which will happen again. And whether it's the Spanish flu or COVID-19, or the Black Death for that matter, I mean, these things happen and they will happen again, and we need to find a way of working our way through it. It's very interesting talking to other colleagues who, when they're developing these machines which will enable us to identify whether we do or we don't have COVID. I mean, there are massive opportunities there. But when we can get to that position where you can actually go into a high street or a shop or a town or on an aeroplane and you can identify within 10 minutes whether or not you've got it, that will make a significant difference to where we are at the moment. So I think for Gloucestershire, we're lucky where we live. We're really lucky where we live, and there are great opportunities in the county.
No, I think you're right, Peter. Peter, thank you. That was every bit as interesting as the conversations we've been having in the interest group, and it's great to be able to have 20-25 minutes of your time. Thank you very much indeed. And we hope to be having more of these conversations with initially other members of the business group, but also probably other members of the company as well. And it's been good to have had this one with you, Peter. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.